When Afghanistan held its presidential election in August, Professor Rani Mullen was there.
Well, I came just a few days, 4 days before elections were actually held, so I stayed in Kabul, and what I observed was in Kabul. And what I saw were elections that were fairly free and fair. People were quite, election observers knew what they were doing, knew the procedures, people came to vote. There wasn't a huge turnout, but things seemed to work relatively well. There were some problems, but they were minor. They were not of the whole-scale kind of fraud that we are now talking about. But I think by the next day, when we started to hear from our colleagues who were based outside of Kabul observing elections, it quickly became apparent that what happened in Kabul was not the norm. I met with Ashraf Ghani the day after the elections. Ashraf Ghani was one of the presidential candidates in these elections, and he showed us reports of, massive whole-scale fraud. And so this is what we're talking about. We're not talking about one person going and voting twice. We're talking about entire election polling stations that were not able to or did not open up due to security reasons or whatever, but where nevertheless the maximum number of ballots were placed in favor of Karzai.
In this fledgling democracy, actively participating in the process has its risks.
There was a bombing that took place outside the Afghan embassy just a week before elections in Kabul. There were threats by the Taliban that they were going to cut off the fingers of people who had gone to vote because they would have the purple ink on their hand. So in that kind of environment where you have to fear for your own personal safety, one would have to ask oneself, would you go out and vote under that kind of threat from the Taliban? And given that threat, that nevertheless about 35% of the population turned up, 1 in 3, it's pretty admirable, I think.
With the accusations of fraud, what's next?
The elections took place August 20th, and preliminary results were posted, which gave Hamid Karzai, the current president of Afghanistan, more than 50% of the vote. If these election results are confirmed and they stand at him getting over 50%, then he will be the president of Afghanistan. If he does not get 50% of the vote, then it will go to a runoff. And the Afghan constitution states that runoffs will have to be held within 2 weeks of the announcement of the final election results, which, if they are announced in the next 2 weeks, would put a second round, if it comes to that, at the end of October. And that's probably the latest that it can be held due to geographic concerns. In Afghanistan, in the very high-lying areas, you start to have snowfall, so mountains and entire villages become inaccessible.
What are the chances that there will be a second round of voting and that Karzai will remain president?
50-50, to put a number on it. I think it seems that most of the international community, and indeed Afghans, are betting that Hamid Karzai is going to be the next president, whether it's with a first round result or a second round result.
Some want to affirm the election and move on. What are the dangers in that?
There's some in the international community who are saying, given the security problems we have in Afghanistan, given the geographic and time constraints, let's just get on with it and let these elections be done. But I think that really sends a wrong message to the Afghans, who we pushed to go out and vote. We said that their vote mattered, and so they should, despite threats from the Taliban and others, should go out and vote on election day. And I think we really need to think about this not only as a one-time election, but what do we need to do here to get people to believe in the process? Because if people don't believe in the system, that in fact gives the Taliban the upper hand. This is not only about defeating al-Qaeda, because if you don't address the root cause of al-Qaeda and the Taliban, which is, desperate poverty and a system that was so corrupt, then you have the makings of another kind of scenario where the Taliban come back and come back to stay, and Al Qaeda finds a host that can host them again.